In 1692, an elderly man named Thies of Kaltenbrunn stood before a court in Livonia, modern Latvia, and made a startling declaration. He was a werewolf, but not an evil one. He insisted he served God rather than the devil, claiming to be a protector of his community. He was a self-described hound of God who battled witches and even Satan himself to safeguard the harvest. At a time when werewolves and witches were commonly associated with diabolical pacts, this claim was baffling to the judges. Thies's trial took place in Jürgensburg, a town in Swedish-ruled Livonia, in 1691 and 1692. He was nearly 80 years old, and a local character whom nobles had long suspected of being involved in unusual activities. Initially, the court summoned Thies merely as a witness in a church burglary case, not to investigate witchcraft. However, Thies freely volunteered information about his lycanthropic adventures, even though it was unrelated to the burglary. He calmly admitted that he had been a werewolf, though he claimed to have given it up about a decade earlier, and began to describe an entirely different kind of werewolf lore. According to Thies's account, werewolves like him transformed into wolf form on 3 specific nights each year when the crops were ready to harvest. On those nights, he said, he and his fellow werewolves would journey down to hell. Hell, in Thies's telling, was not a fiery pit beneath the earth, but an underground realm reached through a swamp at the end of the sea near his village. In that infernal place, Thies claimed, witches and sorcerers in league with the devil were hoarding the community's grain, livestock, and other fruits of the earth. The werewolves' mission was to do battle with these malevolent forces, retrieve the stolen abundance, and restore it to the surface world. Far from feasting alongside the devil, Thies portrayed the werewolves as raiders in hell, snatching back morsels of food while dodging the devil's guardians armed with iron whips. The judges listened with a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Unaccustomed to hearing a self-professed werewolf insist he was on God's side, they pressed Thies for more details, perhaps hoping to expose some contradiction or diabolic trickery. Thies, however, was ready with colorful answers to almost every question. He described how a witch had once broken his nose with a broomstick during a hell-bound scuffle years earlier. In fact, it was an injury the court records corroborated, which is why he had previously appeared in court to accuse that witch in a different matter. He explained various methods by which one might become a werewolf, at one point suggesting that the power could be passed by a magical toast. He described breathing into a jug and handing it to another person while saying, "You will become like me." Throughout the interrogation, Thies emphatically rejected the idea that his powers came from Satan. In his mind, the real servants of the devil were the witches stealing the crops, not the werewolves who fought to get them back. He had, in essence, created an entire universe where werewolves were the good guys fighting against all of Satan's hordes. Some have questioned whether there was some deeper allegorical meaning to what he was saying, but I'll come back to that shortly. Thies's insistence that he was a righteous werewolf had serious implications in the context of 17th century witch trials. Europe's witch hunt era was grounded in Christian authorities' belief that anyone trafficking in supernatural powers, be it witch, werewolf, or sorcerer, must be in league with the devil. In prior werewolf trials, such as the infamous 16th century cases in France, accused werewolves like Pierre Bourgault and Michel Verdun admitted to heinous crimes under the devil's influence. Against this backdrop, Thies's claim to be fighting against the devil was virtually unheard of. By asserting a godly purpose for his shape-shifting, he challenged the binary thinking of the era that cast all occult or magical activity as inherently satanic. The court in Jürgensburg struggled to make sense of Thies. They even summoned the local Lutheran pastor to admonish the old man and urge him to repent for his sin of being a werewolf. Thies would not back down and come to heel. He flatly refused to confess to any evil or express remorse, maintaining that he had done good work. He refused to acknowledge the authority of the pastor, claiming that the pastor had never actually done any real combat against the forces of the devil. Such defiance of church authority, especially coming from a peasant, was extraordinary. In the end, the court found Thies guilty of heresy, essentially for espousing beliefs that could turn people away from Christianity. This was a notable verdict. He was not convicted of witchcraft or lycanthropy per se, since he claimed no diabolic pact, but of promoting a heterodox narrative. For his stubbornness, Thies was flogged with 20 lashes and banished from the region for life. This punishment, while appearing to modernize to be severe, was notably lenient in that an acknowledged werewolf was let go. The trial of this good werewolf thus ended with Thies alive but exiled, his ideas formally condemned even as they lived on in local lore. Modern researchers have explored Thies's remarkable claims to understand where such an idea of a beneficent werewolf could have come from. One influential interpretation comes from noted historian Carlo Ginzburg, who drew parallels between Thies's account and other European folk traditions. These traditions place special individuals in nocturnal battles against witches. In his book The Night Battles, Ginzburg compared Thies to the Benandanti of 16th century Italy. These were a group of northern Italian peasants who claimed their spirits left their bodies at night to fight witches and safeguard the year's crops. Much like Thies, the Italian Benandanti insisted they were doing God's work, not Satan's, even though the Inquisition eventually persecuted them as witches. Ginzburg argued that such beliefs might be survivals of pre-Christian shamanic cults, ancient agrarian rituals that persisted in folk culture under Christian dominance. In this view, Thies would be one of the last representatives of a pagan tradition in Livonia, perhaps a Baltic fertility cult or shamanic practice, reinterpreted through a Christian framework. The emphasis on seasonal battles for crop fertility, the trance-like transformation into animal form, and the idea of a spiritual elite defending the community all hint at shamanistic or pagan roots. Further, the court documents report that he was known to the locals as Old Thies, indicating that he likely held an informal position as a wise elder to the local peasants. That said, not all scholars agree with Ginzburg's hypothesis of an unbroken pagan survival. Some have critiqued the idea as too simplistic, cautioning that we should be careful about projecting a single ancient tradition behind Thies's testimony. Werewolf beliefs varied widely across Europe, and what happened in Livonia might have been a more recent cultural development. Others have suggested it may even have been a personalized belief system of Thies and his local peasant community. What is clear is that Livonia had a reputation in early modern Europe for werewolf lore. Throughout the 1600s, accounts of Livonian werewolves circulated in learned texts, and the region's remote forested landscape likely fed the imagination of both locals and outside writers. Thies's story may have drawn on elements of local folklore, for instance, Baltic legends about wolf spirits. This may have combined with his own experiences and perhaps even a bit of inventive storytelling when pressed in court. Beyond questions of ancient tradition, modern scholars also see Thies's good werewolf as a symbol of resistance and subversion in a time of strict social and religious hierarchy. Some interpretations emphasize the social context of Livonia. In the 17th century, this was a highly stratified society, ruled by a Baltic German landowning class over a native Latvian and Estonian peasantry. Some scholars believe that the entire story was understood by the judges not to be a serious confession of lycanthropy, but rather, in essence, a social commentary. In this view, in his testimony, what he was really describing were the rich landlords as evil witches and humble godly peasants as werewolves who preserve the harvest. This reading sees Thies's werewolf identity as a kind of subversive cultural tradition, a way for an oppressed class to frame their struggle in familiar folkloric terms. In other words, if the ruling class feared the locals as wild werewolves, Thies's response was yes, we are werewolves, but we're on God's side and we protect our own against your evils. This interpretation, of course, is not universally accepted, but it does potentially offer meaningful insight into why this holy werewolf was let off comparatively easy. Bushido, often translated as the way of the warrior, is famously known as the moral and ethical code of the samurai, Japan's warrior class. It evokes romantic images of armored swordsmen upholding ideals of honor, loyalty, and bravery. Yet historians have long debated whether a unified code of Bushido truly guided samurai throughout history, or if our modern idea of Bushido is largely a later invention. When we look at Japan's medieval and early modern periods, we find that samurai did follow certain ethical ideals, such as loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, and courage in battle. These values developed slowly over the centuries. For example, as early as the 13th century Kamakura period, warrior tales emphasized bravery and honor, like announcing one's name before combat, as virtues for samurai. However, there was no single formal Bushido code in these eras. In fact, the Japanese word Bushido, literally warrior's way, is rarely found in pre-modern texts. The concept of a samurai honor code certainly existed in various forms, but it was not a fixed written doctrine universally followed across all samurai families. Different domains and eras had their own house codes and philosophies for warriors. Many famous samurai texts like Hagakure or Budo Shoshinshu do articulate samurai virtues. However, these were written long after the age of constant warfare, often as nostalgia or guidance during the long peace of the Edo period. Notably, Hagakure itself was not widely read until the 20th century, when it became celebrated as a Bushido classic. Historical evidence also shows that actual samurai behavior did not always match the later Bushido ideal. Loyalty, for instance, was often pragmatic. During the age of warring states in the 15th and 16th centuries, many samurai changed allegiances when it was advantageous. Scholars have noted that the image of unwavering fealty to one lord, or the emperor, was largely a product of Edo period storytelling and not the reality before 1600. Early chronicles even describe clans intentionally splitting their members' loyalties between rival sides to ensure the family's survival regardless of the conflict's outcome. Treachery, mercenary rewards, and brutality were not uncommon in samurai warfare, much like in any other warrior culture. Chivalrous individuals certainly existed, as they do in all societies, and samurai epics celebrate heroes who died for honor or loyalty. But as one early 20th century scholar, B.H. Chamberlain, observed, quote, Bushido, as an institution or a code of rules, has never existed. Those later accounts of a strict code were, he argued, fabricated out of whole cloth, a mythologized retrofitting of history. While that may be an extreme view, it highlights the fact that our modern notion of an eternal, unchanging samurai code is oversimplified. If Bushido was not a formal medieval code, how did it become so famous? The answer lies in the Meiji era and Japan's nation-building efforts. After the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the samurai class was effectively abolished as a social status. Yet paradoxically, it was after the samurai were gone that Bushido as a concept truly flourished. During Japan's rapid modernization, leaders and thinkers sought symbols of national identity that could inspire unity and pride. They began to recast samurai ideals into a modern context, a process one historian has called the inventing of Bushido. By the 1880s and 1890s, Japanese intellectuals started referencing Bushido in writings, presenting it as a long-standing samurai principle of loyalty and honor. In reality, as studies have shown, the concept of Bushido was largely unknown in Japan before the 1890s, and only gained wide currency after 1900. This was no coincidence. It aligned with Japan's rising nationalism and its military victories. Simply put, Bushido was being reinvented to meet contemporary needs, and also provided a homegrown framework for thinkers who felt Japan was becoming overly westernized. Further, it wouldn't have made sense for the general populace to have any meaningful understanding of Bushido prior to this time. When the samurai class existed as an institution, they ruled over peasants who didn't share the same rights, privileges, or responsibilities that they did. As Japan modernized, these varying social classes needed to be formed into a cohesive history. One of the most influential figures in this reinvention was Nitobe Inazo, who in 1900 published Bushido, The Soul of Japan. This book, which was written in English for a Western audience, stitched together samurai anecdotes, Confucian ethics, and his own ideals to explain Japan's samurai spirit to the world. Tellingly, Nitobe portrayed Bushido as a timeless code of virtues: benevolence, honesty, honor, loyalty, akin to a Japanese form of chivalry. He downplayed violent or feudal aspects and emphasized moral virtues, making Bushido palatable and even admirable to Western readers. The timing was perfect. Japan's stunning victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 drew global attention, and observers latched onto Bushido as an explanation for Japanese soldiers' bravery. Nitobe's romanticized version of Bushido thus profoundly shaped both Western and Japanese perceptions. Ironically, the Japanese public themselves read Nitobe's ideas only after they'd been validated abroad, and a Japanese translation of his book did not appear until 1908. During the Meiji and Taisho periods, Bushido concepts were woven into Japan's military ethos and education system. Textbooks extolled samurai loyalty and sacrifice, which were now fully transferred to loyalty to the emperor and nation. The context was changed from loyalty to one's immediate lord in a feudal-type structure to loyalty to the emperor and the Japanese state. By the 1930s, this had evolved into what was called Imperial Bushido. Under Imperial Japanese ideology, especially leading into World War II, Bushido was used as a rallying moral code for soldiers and citizens. The feudal loyalty of samurai to their lord was reinterpreted as absolute loyalty to the Japanese state and people, both of which were embodied by the emperor himself. Self-sacrifice and honor in death were emphasized to encourage military fanaticism, contributing to phenomena like kamikaze pilots and the ethic of fighting to the last man. The government actively promoted this warrior spirit. For example, schoolchildren were taught samurai stories of selfless loyalty, and soldiers were issued manuals on the imperial way of the warrior. This state-crafted Bushido stressed obedience, courage, and death before dishonor. Bushido had thus been nationalized, turned into a tool to foster unity and militarism. However, when Japan was defeated in 1945, the Bushido-fueled militaristic spirit largely collapsed. Many Japanese became disillusioned with these ideals, seeing them as having been misused to justify war and sacrifice. In the post-war era, direct references to Bushido in Japan became rare and even awkward, except among die-hard nationalists. The post-Meiji journey of Bushido shows how a once obscure concept was repackaged in modern times, partly invented and partly resurrected to serve contemporary ideologies. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also, be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. In the summer of 1764, the quiet hills of Gévaudan in southern France became the hunting grounds of a mysterious predator. When 14-year-old Jeanne Boulet was found brutally mauled in late June, her slaying was recognized as the first attack of what would soon be called the Beast of Gévaudan. This creature would terrorize the region for the next 3 years. By the time the beast's reign ended in 1767, it had attacked well over 100 people, with the majority of its victims suffering brutal fates. After Jeanne Boulet's death in 1764, more horrific attacks quickly followed. Villagers across the Gévaudan region began encountering the same nightmare, a huge wolf-like creature springing from the forests to attack people working in the fields or tending livestock. The victims were often women and little ones, who were more vulnerable while out in the pastures. Survivors described a beast with shaggy reddish fur and a black stripe down its back, larger than any ordinary wolf. Many victims were found with their throats torn out or even worse, fueling rumors that a monster, not just a normal wolf, was on the loose. Fear gripped the countryside and parents kept their children close, and farmers started routinely carrying weapons to the fields. Local leaders organized hunting parties, but the beast proved cunning and elusive. In one remarkable incident in January 1765, a group of village children led by a boy named Jacques Portefeuille managed to fight off the creature by sticking together. Their bravery caught the attention of King Louis XV, who promptly dispatched royal hunters to the region to help put an end to the terror. In 1765, professional wolf hunters were dispatched to Gévaudan, under the king's orders. Initially, an experienced father and son wolf hunting team combed the countryside, but after they failed, the king's own hunt master, François Antoine, was sent to take charge of the affair. In September 1765, Antoine eliminated an enormous wolf believed to be the beast. The carcass was sent to Versailles as proof, and Antoine was hailed as a hero. At first, it seemed the nightmare was over, but only for a short time. A few months later, new attacks were reported. In December 1765 and into 1766, people in Gévaudan once again fell victim to a ferocious attacker with the same bloody methods. It became clear that either the original beast had survived, or there was another one still at large. By now, the royal court had lost interest, assuming the problem was solved, so the local people were left to fend for themselves. A local nobleman, the Marquis d'Apcher, continued to organize hunts with the assistance of determined villagers. Finally, during a hunt in June 1767, a farmer and hunter named Jean Chastel shot a large wolf-like animal. This marked the end of the beast's reign of terror, and after Chastel's bullet found its mark, the attack stopped for good. According to popular accounts, the creature's body was opened and found to contain human remains, grim evidence that the right animal had been slain. In the end, perhaps around 100 people fell to the claws and teeth of the demon wolf in the 3-year rampage, making the Beast of Gévaudan one of history's deadliest animals. Even after the Beast of Gévaudan was slain, the question remained: what kind of creature had it been? At the time, many locals believed it was no ordinary wolf. Some even thought a supernatural evil was at work. Eyewitness descriptions varied wildly. Some said it looked like a gigantic wolf, while others noted strange features that didn't match any known animal. Or perhaps I should say they didn't match any known local animal. These conflicting accounts only fueled more speculation, both back then and in the years since. A very plausible theory is that the animal was, in fact, a wolf or wolves. In 18th century France, wolf attacks on people, though not common, did happen, and Gévaudan was a remote region filled to the brim with wolves. The way victims were attacked, with their throats torn out, is consistent with wolf predation, and indeed several large wolves were slain during the hunt for the beast. Some even speculated the beast was a wolf-dog hybrid, bred for exceptional size and ferocity, but this is essentially a variation on the wolf theory. It's also quite possible that more than one wolf was involved over the years. Today, most mainstream historians consider an unusually aggressive and large wolf to be the most likely explanation for the beast of Gévaudan. Another theory blames an escaped exotic animal, such as a lion or a hyena, for the attacks. The descriptions of the beast's appearance and its sheer ferocity could fit these creatures, and such creatures were occasionally kept in France at the time. A subadult male lion, for instance, might not have a full mane, and could match key details of the reports, such as the tawny color, the tufted tail, and the strength to carry off victims. Likewise, a hyena with its striped back and powerful build might explain the monster seen by witnesses. It's conceivable that a lion or hyena could have escaped from a private menagerie or traveling circus and prowled the countryside. However, there's no record of any such creature disappearing at this time, so this idea, while intriguing, remains speculative. More bizarre theories suggest human or supernatural causes. One notion was that a deranged individual used a trained animal, like a large mastiff dog decked out in full armor, to carry out the attacks. However, no evidence has ever been brought forth to indicate that any such person existed. Others truly believed the creature was a cursed being or a werewolf. Since it was never conclusively identified, the beast of Gévaudan remains a legend, as well as a frightening historical reality. People still debate whether it was a wolf, a hybrid, or something more exotic, or perhaps disturbing. But the truth is that no one will ever be able to say the truth with certainty. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. There are a lot of mysteries surrounding JFK and his assassination, and with the release of additional JFK files, renewed attention is being placed on this seminal historical incident. The babushka lady earned her nickname from the headscarf under her chin, resembling those worn by elderly Russian women. In photos and films of the day, she is seen wearing a tan or dark coat, sunglasses, and the kerchief on her head. She was positioned on the lawn between Elm and Main Streets, very close to the presidential limousine's path, at the moment the shot struck Kennedy. As other spectators reacted in panic, this woman was captured calmly standing with her camera held up to her face, apparently documenting the tragedy in real time. Eyewitnesses and multiple recordings confirm her presence. In one film sequence, even after the final shot, when most people had dropped to the ground, the babushka lady can be seen still standing and filming. This is a detail that has fueled endless speculation about what she knew or captured on film. Researchers have tracked the babushka lady's movements across these recordings. Initially, she was standing on the south side of Elm Street. After the shots, she crossed Elm and moved toward the grassy knoll area, mingling with other stunned bystanders. The last known images of her show her walking east along Elm Street, away from the scene. Strangely, while many witnesses stayed to give statements, this woman never identified herself to police. It appears she quietly slipped away in the crowd, leaving only the enigmatic photographic evidence of her presence. In the aftermath, investigators realized that this unidentified woman might have captured crucial evidence on her film camera. Yet despite public appeals, the babushka lady never came forward, and no film was turned in under that description. The Warren Commission's inquiry in 1964 made note of many witnesses in Dealey Plaza, but she remained just a mysterious figure in the background. Years later, the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to resolve lingering questions about JFK's death. In 1979, the HSCA's Photographic Analysis Panel reported that certain items known to exist could not be located, among them the Babushka Lady film. Investigators scoured archives and interviewed witnesses, but came up empty-handed regarding any footage this woman might have taken. The elusive film was treated as a lost piece of evidence. There was one intriguing clue revealed decades later. In 1994, researcher Gary Mack testified to the Assassination Records Review Board about a story he had heard from a Kodak film processing employee in Dallas. According to this account, on the day of the assassination, a woman in her early 30s with brunette hair brought in a roll of film that she said showed the assassination scene. Federal investigators were already at the Kodak lab processing Abraham Zapruder's now famous film. The woman reportedly told them she had run across the lawn and snapped a photo of the president's limo and the Texas school book depository in the same frame. However, the Kodak staff said that her photo turned out extremely blurry and virtually useless, and the woman left without anyone recording her identity. Gary Mack suspected that this individual could have been the Babushka Lady, a bystander who unknowingly captured only a poor image and thus quietly went home. This story, while unconfirmed, suggests a mundane explanation that her film simply failed to reveal anything significant. The mystery deepened in 1970 when a woman named Beverly Oliver came forward and declared that she was the Babushka Lady. She described using a movie camera, a Yashica Super 8 model, and claimed that after the shooting, two men who identified themselves as FBI agents approached her. According to Oliver, these agents convinced her to hand over the undeveloped film, promising to return it within 10 days. She said she never received a receipt or any confirmation and never saw her film again. Oliver later elaborated that she complied partly because the men seemed authoritative and partly because she was afraid of getting in trouble. She claimed that she had a small amount of pot in her possession at the time and feared legal consequences. Researchers have found many reasons to doubt Oliver's account. For one, the camera she claimed to use, the Yashica Super 8, did not exist in 1963. Super 8 film was only introduced in 1965. Confronted with this fact, Oliver insisted she had been given an experimental prototype camera by a friend, though this explanation remains unsubstantiated. Investigators also note that in 1963, Beverly Oliver was a 17-year-old, tall and slim, whereas the Babushka Lady appears to be a shorter, middle-aged woman in the films and photographs. Additionally, Oliver dramatically embellished her story over time. She added additional facts, including a claim that she was associated with both Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. No credible evidence supports these sensational claims, though she does still have her supporters up to the present day. Given these discrepancies, most historians and experts on the topic remain unconvinced by Oliver's tale. Famed prosecutor and author Vincent Bugliosi wrote that Oliver, quote, never proved to most people's satisfaction that she was in Dealey Plaza that day. To date, no one besides Beverly Oliver has ever claimed to be the Babushka Lady, and her identification is widely regarded as unproven. With the real Babushka Lady remaining unidentified, a variety of theories have arisen to explain her calm behavior and possible role in the JFK saga. Mainstream historians tend to view her as an ordinary citizen caught in extraordinary events. The simplest explanation is that she was a tourist or local bystander who brought a camera to film the presidential motorcade. Notably, numerous people had brought their new technology out that day for this big event. Most historians agree that she likely never came forward out of fear or merely because her footage turned out poor. If the Kodak story related by Gary Mack is accurate, the Babushka Lady may have indeed attempted to develop her film and finding nothing of value, chose to fade into anonymity. In this interpretation, her unflinching composure during the events could have been shock at the horror she was witnessing. On the other hand, the babushka lady's mysterious actions have made her a magnet for conspiracy theories. One popular notion speculates that she was a covert agent, perhaps a Soviet spy, or a spy for another hostile nation, given the Cold War context. Under this theory, she was sent to covertly record and report on the events of that day. Another theory suggests she might have been working for a certain U.S. intelligence agency. Conspiracists point to her steady nerves, not ducking like the others, as suspicious, implying she might have known the shots were coming. Some even propose that the camera she held wasn't a camera at all, but a concealed weapon or communication device as part of a wider conspiracy. More fringe ideas include claims that the babushka lady was a time traveler who had advanced knowledge and technology and went back to observe the day. Regardless of the truth, what remains known is that the authorities were never able to track her down, despite significant efforts over the years. Toward the end of World War II, Allied pilots began reporting strange lights pacing their aircraft during nighttime missions. These unexplained aerial phenomena were first noted in late 1944 by crews of the U.S. 415th Night Fighter Squadron operating over Western Europe. In one notable encounter in November 1944, pilot Edward Schluter and his crew witnessed a cluster of bright orange lights flying alongside them near the Rhine River. The lights, numbering about 8 to 10, moved swiftly and with uncanny agility. Despite attempts to track them on radar or engage them in combat, the mysterious lights would vanish and reappear, seemingly playing cat and mouse with the astonished airmen. News of these encounters spread through squadrons and even reached the press. By New Year's 1945, American newspapers had picked up the story of what pilots were calling Foo Fighters. The term Foo came from a popular comic strip of the era, Smokey Stover, where a fireman character quipped, "Where there's foo, there's fire." And yeah, personally, I don't really get the humor either. I guess it was a different time. Radar operator Donald Myers, a fan of the comic, coined the name Foo Fighters for these bizarre flying lights, and it quickly became the label for this wartime mystery. After the initial encounters, reports of Foo Fighters were not isolated to a single squadron or region. Allied airmen across the European theater, and even in the Pacific, described similar encounters. The typical Foo Fighter sighting involved one or several glowing orbs or fiery balls of light-tailing aircraft at high speed. Pilots described them as red, orange, white, or even green lights that could appear singly or in groups, occasionally arranged as if in formation. They often seemed to toy with the airplanes, matching maneuvers, circling, and making sudden turns or bursts of speed, far beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft of the time. What made Foo Fighters especially eerie to the crews was that despite their visual presence, the objects never appeared on radar screens. They emitted no recognizable radio signals, dropped no bombs, and never fired weapons. In fact, these glowing pursuers never caused direct harm in any way whatsoever. Still, they unnerved even veteran aviators. Many pilots initially suspected these could be some new enemy weapon, a remote-controlled device or an advanced fighter meant to harass or disorient Allied flyers. Yet, attempts to outmaneuver or shoot at the lights were futile. Foo Fighters would simply dart away or vanish abruptly. Eyewitnesses across different nationalities found commonality in their stories. Beyond American and British crews, even some German and Japanese pilots reportedly observed similar inexplicable lights during missions. This broader pattern suggested that Foo Fighters were not the handiwork of any one side in the conflict. By late 1944 and early 1945, Foo Fighter sightings had become frequent enough that military leadership took note, and official inquiries were set in motion to solve the mystery. As the phenomenon gained attention, various theories emerged to explain what these Foo Fighters might be. Military authorities and scientists of the era considered a range of possibilities, from the ordinary to the extraordinary. One scientific explanation was that the lights were simply a natural weather phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. This is a harmless discharge of plasma that can glow on aircraft wingtips or antennas during stormy conditions. St. Elmo's fire was familiar to pilots and sailors as a static electric effect that could produce a ghostly glow. However, many Foo Fighter sightings occurred in clear skies and described objects darting around in controlled ways, which did not fit the relatively static, flickering nature of St. Elmo's fire. Another weather-related candidate was ball lightning, an extremely rare and little understood spherical lightning manifestation. Ball lightning could, in theory, account for glowing orbs seen during thunderstorms. Yet, the Foo Fighters seem to persist longer and move more deliberately than any documented ball lightning, which tends to last only seconds and doesn't chase airplanes over long distances. Further, ball lightning is extremely rare and doesn't travel in packs or respond with agency, as the Foo Fighters appeared to do. Psychological explanations were also put forward. Some suggested that war-weary pilots, exhausted from long missions and intense combat, might be hallucinating or misinterpreting ordinary lights as fantastical moving objects. Certainly, combat stress and fatigue can affect perception, and night flying can play tricks on even well-trained eyes. Indeed, the U.S. Navy was concerned enough to study night flying visual illusions in 1945, exploring how pilot fatigue could generate false sightings. However, this hypothesis of mere hallucinations didn't sit well with the airmen who experienced Foo Fighters. Many encounters involved multiple crew members seeing the same phenomenon simultaneously, which would be unlikely if it were all just in their individual minds. These pilots were also considered credible observers, skilled, alert men who, despite the stress of war, were capable of distinguishing optical illusions from real objects. They steadfastly refuted the idea that what they saw was a mirage or a result of battle nerves, especially given the consistency of reports across different crews and nights. Further, photographs of the Foo Fighters were also relatively common, indicating that at least some of the objects were more than mere hallucinations. Technological explanations abounded as well. Early speculation in Allied intelligence circles wondered if the Axis powers had developed a novel weapon or surveillance device. During World War II, Germany in particular was working on cutting-edge technology, including jet fighters and rocket-propelled aircraft. But those aircraft had distinct appearances and performance profiles, and none could perform the gravity-defying maneuvers attributed to Foo Fighters. These wonder weapons also didn't operate in the stealthy and radar-invisible way that characterized these glowing orbs. Furthermore, captured enemy documents and post-war interrogations of German scientists revealed no evidence of a secret program producing such phenomena. An alternative technological theory considered whether Foo Fighters could be a form of psychological warfare, perhaps bright flares or projected lights meant to confuse pilots. However, no one could explain the movement patterns of the Foo Fighters. With conventional explanations faltering, some turned to more exotic ideas. Even during the war, a few imaginative souls mused about otherworldly origins, suggesting that maybe these were visitors from beyond the earth, curious about our conflict. However, during the 1940s, such ideas were on the fringe and not taken seriously by military investigators. It was only after the war, especially with the flying saucer craze beginning in 1947, that people looked back at Foo Fighters with a new question. Curious minds began to question whether these were an early chapter in the modern history of UFO sightings. In hindsight, the resemblance is intriguing. Highly maneuverable lights and objects in the sky, defying easy explanation, playing tag with human aircraft. Indeed, many ufologists have claimed the Foo Fighters as part of the UFO phenomenon narrative, though this remains a controversial take. Over the years, a handful of writers even revived the speculation of advanced wartime technology, bordering on science fiction. For instance, stories about German Wunderwaffen and experimental flying discs have intertwined with UFO lore, though no concrete evidence ever emerged linking Foo Fighters to any such projects. By and large, the paranormal interpretation that Foo Fighters were extraterrestrial probes or spacecraft remained speculative and without proof. Yet the mystery around the wartime sightings certainly fed into the growing cultural fascination with UFOs. During and immediately after World War II, the Foo Fighter sightings prompted formal investigations. However, no conclusions were reached. Later, in 1953, as UFO sightings were garnering national attention, the CIA convened the Robertson Panel, a group of prominent scientists tasked with evaluating the UFO issue. Foo Fighters were directly mentioned in their deliberations. The Robertson Panel noted that they hadn't shown hostile intent and considered whether natural phenomena could explain them. They suggested possibilities like electrostatic charges similar to St. Elmo's fire, electromagnetic effects, or even light reflections off ice crystals high in the atmosphere. None of these explanations was confirmed as the definitive answer. The panel famously remarked that had the term flying saucer been popular in 1944 and 1945, those pilots would likely have called the Foo Fighters by that now familiar name. The lack of clear answers meant that Foo Fighters lingered as an open case. And so, scientists and enthusiasts have continued to revisit the mystery. In recent years, some researchers have taken a fresh look armed with modern science. According to one hypothesis, the balls of light might form under certain conditions in the thermosphere and then descend to altitudes where warplanes fly. It was theorized that they were drawn by the plane's own electromagnetic emissions, or by atmospheric disturbances like thunderstorms, or even the radiation from wartime events. Such plasmas could potentially move erratically and appear and disappear, which aligns with many Foo Fighter reports. All that said, we're no closer to an explanation of Foo Fighters today than we were in 1945. In the year 1191, amidst the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey in England, a startling announcement shook the medieval world. The monks of that venerable abbey claimed to have unearthed the tomb of none other than the legendary King Arthur, and with him, it was said, the famed sword Excalibur. The Abbey of Glastonbury was an ancient and sacred site, and by the late 12th century it had fallen on hard times. A devastating fire in 1184 had reduced much of the abbey to charred ruins, and the community was desperate for funds to rebuild. Against this backdrop, the abbey's monks announced that they had found King Arthur's grave on their grounds. Gerald of Wales, a respected scholar and royal clerk, provided an eyewitness account around 1193. He described how the diggers went almost 20 feet deep into the earth and discovered a hollowed oak trunk serving as a coffin. Inside were two sets of human remains. The larger bones belonged to a man of giant stature, to say the least. According to Gerald's report, the shin bone exceeded, by several inches, the length of the leg of the tallest monk present, suggesting the man had been Herculean in life. The other, smaller bones and a shock of golden hair were identified as a female, presumed to be Guinevere. When a monk lifted a long lock of this hair, it crumbled to dust in his hand, a poignant detail that Gerald says he himself witnessed. Most convincing of all was a lead cross buried with the coffin, bearing an inscription in Latin. Gerald writes that this cross, shown to him by the abbot, was inscribed in translation as, "Here lies buried the renowned King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon, with Guinevere, his second wife." The inscription explicitly linked Glastonbury to Avalon, the mystical island of Arthurian lore. Further, the names Arthur and Guinevere made the identification of the remains unmistakable to medieval observers. This dramatic find instantly elevated Glastonbury's status. The abbey now claimed the greatest legendary king of Britain as its own revered relic. Notably, while later retellings of the discovery included the sword Excalibur as part of the goods expropriated from the grave, none of the earliest reports actually mention a sword in the coffin. Gerald of Wales, in his detailed account of the exhumation, never refers to a sword at all, and his focus was on the bones and the inscribed cross. Modern historians point out that there is no contemporary evidence a sword was found at Glastonbury in 1191 whatsoever. It seems the association of Excalibur with this discovery may have grown in the telling, or been assumed because of what came next. In the same year, 1191, King Richard I, better known to history as Richard the Lionheart, would famously come into possession of a sword he identified as Excalibur. To understand why the Glastonbury discovery happened when it did, one must consider the political climate of late 12th century Britain. King Henry II, Richard's father, who reigned from 1154 to 1189, had spent years dealing with rebellions. These included resistance from the Welsh princes, who clung to prophecies of Arthur's return. In Celtic folklore, Arthur was the once-and-future king who would someday rise again to defend Britain from foreign foes, as he had previously done centuries prior. This belief was especially powerful among the Welsh, for whom Arthur was a national hero expected to avenge them against Anglo-Norman conquerors. Henry II, according to Gerald of Wales, took a keen interest in the location of Arthur's grave for precisely this reason. He wanted to dispel the Welsh hopes that Arthur might still be alive, or would come back to rally them. Gerald recounted that Henry had disclosed to the monks some evidence about where Arthur could be found. According to Gerald, this information was gathered from historical records, as well as contemporary oral histories sung by Welsh bards. The king had learned that Arthur was supposedly buried between two pyramidal stone pillars in the Glastonbury cemetery. These tales said that his grave was incredibly deep, to hide the grave from Anglo-Saxon marauders, who may have been looking to loot or otherwise desecrate this important site. It was said Henry personally urged the Glastonbury abbot to search in that spot, a fact that later historians find somewhat suspicious. Henry II did not live to see the outcome. He died in 1189. But not long after, the monks followed through and miraculously found the tomb just as Henry's information had suggested. Truly a shocking and miraculous find, if I do say so myself, and the timing couldn't have been better. The discovery provided a propaganda victory for the Plantagenet rulers. It proved, at least in the eyes of credulous contemporaries, that Arthur was truly dead and buried. The message to the Welsh was unmistakable. Their great hero was no immortal savior. He was a mortal man who would not be returning to aid them. By literally unearthing Arthur, the English crown dealt a blow to the political mythology that fueled opposition. Simply put, the once and future King Arthur had definitely been proven, in medieval eyes, to be the once and never again King Arthur. To jump ahead a bit in the historical timeline, the Crown of England even later claimed to subsume Arthur's legacy, to the point where the Celtic nature of Arthur was officially downplayed. For example, later medieval kings like Edward Longshanks would eventually use this discovery to signify that Arthur's dominion now belonged to the English crown. Further, After the full union of Great Britain in the 18th century, Arthur somewhat paradoxically ended up becoming a symbol of Britishness. This despite his entire story being that of Celtic or Romano-Briton resistance to the rule of the Anglo-Saxon invaders. There was also a financial incentive behind the Glastonbury find. The abbey, famous as a pilgrimage site, badly needed to attract pilgrims and their donations to fund rebuilding after the 1184 fire. In the Middle Ages, monasteries commonly claimed saints' relics to boost their fame, and Glastonbury's monks were no exception. In that era, the abbey also publicized finds of other relics. For instance, the remains of St. Patrick were quote-unquote discovered around the same time at Glastonbury. But apparently Irish pilgrims weren't exactly paying the bills, and the monks needed to score a bigger hit. King Arthur's tomb was the ultimate draw, a legendary king discovered in an abbey that, by happy coincidence, could identify itself as Avalon, the very place of Arthur's final rest. Everything was wrapped up in a nice, neat package for the pilgrims, and pilgrims flocked to see Arthur's holy bones, and Glastonbury profited. In fact, modern scholars universally conclude that the monks' discovery was a hoax, a deliberate if ingenious medieval fraud. Their timing was perfect, coming when Geoffrey of Monmouth's popular tales of Arthur were circulating widely. The Glastonbury monks seized that moment to put their abbey on the map. Given their major score, they could even count on wealthy pilgrims from as far away as France and the Holy Roman Empire making a detour to shower donations upon their abbey. Meanwhile, even as the Glastonbury announcement caused a stir in England, King Richard I was far away in the Mediterranean, embroiled in the Third Crusade. In early 1191, Richard arrived in Sicily, where he negotiated with King Tancred of Sicily. The two monarchs struck an alliance in March 1191, formalized by the Treaty of Messina. Part of their agreement involved settling a dispute over Richard's sister Joan, who had been Queen of Sicily, and a proposed marriage alliance involving Richard's nephew, Arthur of Brittany. To cement their newfound friendship, an exchange of expensive gifts and artifacts took place. It was during these negotiations that Richard presented Tancred with an extraordinary diplomatic gift, a sword which he identified as Excalibur, the sword of King Arthur. This is one of the earliest historical references to the Arthurian sword in a real political context. It shows that by 1191 the legend of Excalibur was not only well known in Britain, but had also reached continental Europe. Even a Norman ruler in Sicily could appreciate its significance. Richard's choice to give away Excalibur has intrigued historians. It might seem odd for a proud king, especially one like Richard, renowned for his prowess, to part with the legendary sword of Britain so casually. Some have speculated that Richard intended the gesture as a grand statement of trust and alliance, or even as political theater. By handing Excalibur to Tancred, Richard perhaps signaled that he, a modern Lionheart, valued crusading camaraderie over clinging to ancient myth. Whatever Richard's motives, the gift to Tancred is the last known historical sighting of Excalibur. Shortly thereafter, Tancred died in 1194, and Sicily fell quickly to the forces of Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. The fate of the sword is unknown from that point onwards, with various theories suggesting where it may have ended up. Some have suggested that perhaps it was brought to Germany or northern Italy, where the sword was subsequently incorrectly catalogued. Others suggest that it was simply looted in the chaos of the takeover of Sicily, and again, simply faded into history. The aftermath of the Glastonbury discovery and Richard's Arthurian gift reverberated through later medieval history. Glastonbury Abbey capitalized on its claim to Arthur and Guinevere's tomb, and the site became a pilgrimage attraction for centuries to come. In fact, Glastonbury continues to draw King Arthur-related tourists almost a millennium after this so-called miraculous discovery. But let's get back to the historicity of the miraculous find and the subsequent gift to King Tancred for a moment. From the recorded descriptions, experts note the inscription's style and Latin phrasing seem more consistent with a 12th century creation. For example, calling Guinevere Arthur's second wife is something that experts noted would have happened in a late medieval burial, but would have been unknown in an early medieval one. If the burial was really from late antiquity, or the early medieval period when King Arthur supposedly lived, Guinevere would simply be referenced as his wife. Simply put, the inscription is a bit too on the nose in an effort to make it appear that this couldn't just be any Arthur, but the actual real mythic King Arthur those Welsh rebels think will save them. Further, King Henry feeding the monks the information is also highly suspect, given his problems with the Welsh and their belief that King Arthur wasn't dead, just sleeping. In short, all signs point to an opportunistic hoax carried out by Glastonbury's monks, pulled off with royal backing. The Excalibur that Richard handed to Tancred, likewise, was thus almost certainly a fabrication in the sense that it was not truly Arthur's sword. But some have questioned whether the weapon given over was even the same one allegedly dug up at Glastonbury. Ultimately, the saga of Arthur's tomb and this 12th century Excalibur are just another layer of mystery added onto Arthurian legend. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for contemporary crime-related mysteries. Also be sure to take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. In the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, as the war in Europe reached its violent end, one of the Reich's most feared henchmen simply vanished. The man was Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, which had functioned as Germany's secret state police. Amid this chaos, Müller was last seen in the command bunker with high-level leaders on the evening of May 1st, 1945. He was calm but determined, reportedly declaring, "I have no intention of being taken prisoner by the Russians." Then, like a ghost, Heinrich Müller simply disappeared, and no confirmed trace of him has ever been found. To this day, he remains the highest-level official of the Third Reich who has never been found. Heinrich Müller was not a household name during the Third Reich era, at least not to the general public, but within the corridors of the police state he was both respected and feared. Born in 1900 and hardened by service as a combat pilot in World War I, Müller joined the Munich police after that war. He earned a reputation as an aggressive investigator, especially against communists, unconstrained by legal norms or mercy. This caught the attention of party leaders, including Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, architects of the Third Reich's internal security apparatus. By 1939, he had become the chief of the Gestapo, answering directly to Heydrich and later Himmler. As Gestapo chief, Müller was deeply involved in the darkest crimes of the Third Reich and was a key organizer of political repression and terror. From his desk, this cold bureaucrat directed the persecution of anyone deemed an enemy of the state. But this video isn't the history of the Gestapo, so let's jump ahead to 1945. The Allies began rounding up surviving leaders of the Reich, and the search for Heinrich Müller commenced almost immediately, but from the start, investigators found only frustration. In the summer of 1945, Allied war crimes teams scoured Berlin for clues to Müller's fate. They questioned former colleagues and combed through charred records. A few leads emerged, with some eyewitnesses claiming that he had been seen fleeing the bunker. To complicate matters, Heinrich Müller was a painfully common name in Germany. Tracking sightings of a middle-aged, nondescript man named Heinrich Müller is the equivalent to issuing an alert to be on the lookout for John Smith. Numerous men shared the name, and some even matched the former chief's general description. Through the late 1940s, American and British intelligence agencies continued to pursue any hint of Müller. They searched the home of his former mistress in 1947 and monitored mail and communications, hoping the fugitive might contact his loved ones. But there was only silence, and by the end of the decade, as the Cold War set in, priorities shifted. Hunting down former Third Reich officials was no longer the top mission as the West came into rapid conflict with the Eastern Bloc. As years passed, Heinrich Müller's fate became the subject of myriad theories, some plausible, others bordering on fantastical. During the Cold War, both the Western and Eastern blocs found it useful to stoke rumors about the missing Gestapo chief. In the 1950s, whispers circulated that Müller might have been taken by the Soviet Union. It wasn't an absurd idea. The NKVD, Soviet intelligence, had captured numerous officials and scientists. Some speculated that his techniques on internal repression were of interest to Stalin, and that he may have been brought in to train secret police in the Soviet Union. Even Walter Schellenberg, a former high-ranking intelligence officer, wrote in his memoir that Müller had supposedly defected to the USSR in 1945 and was later seen in Moscow. No concrete evidence ever emerged for this, but the mere notion was chilling. This man who was responsible for immense suffering may still be up to his old tricks. The flip side of this rumor appeared in propaganda as well. Soviet and East German sources occasionally hinted that Müller had actually escaped to the West. In the disinformation tug-of-war, each side implied the other might be sheltering this notorious war criminal. The dramatic capture of Eichmann in 1960, Müller's subordinate in the Gestapo, reignited hope that Müller could also be found. If Eichmann could hide in Argentina for 15 years and then be caught, perhaps Müller was out there too. During interrogation, Eichmann himself reportedly said he believed his old boss was still alive, but either couldn't or wouldn't provide any further details. This tantalizing hint spurred new investigations in West Germany. Authorities put Müller's remaining family and former associates under surveillance for any sign of contact, but again, nothing definitive surfaced. For a long time, the dominant theory, by process of elimination, was that Heinrich Müller most likely died during the fall of Berlin in 1945. It seemed a reasonable conclusion. Many high-ranking German officials chose death over capture, and Müller had explicitly said he would do so. A high-level Polish defector claimed, in 1961, that the Soviets had taken him to Moscow, not as a prisoner, but as an asset. According to this theory, some have speculated that after the death of Stalin, he was silently eliminated. In 2001, the CIA file on Heinrich Müller was released, which proved, if the records are to be believed, that the CIA itself was never in contact with Müller after the war. Notably, in 1967, a man in Panama bore such a strong resemblance to Heinrich Müller that Müller's wife identified him as the former Gestapo chief. After fingerprint analyses were conducted, the man, who was facing extradition to West Germany, was released. He was definitively not Heinrich Müller, despite his appearance. And if you're one of those people who just listens, I've put a photograph of Müller up beside this Panamanian man. Personally, I find the resemblance between the two men disturbingly similar, but it looks as though this man simply had the misfortune of being born the doppelganger to Müller. Medieval kings often left behind illegitimate children, but few are as enigmatic as Philip of Cognac. Philip was the only acknowledged illegitimate son of King Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. and yet we know remarkably little about him. In particular, the identity of Philip's mother remains an unsolved mystery. Historians have scoured chronicles and records, but no contemporary source names the woman who bore Richard's son. This silence has fueled centuries of speculation and intrigue. Who was she, and why has history forgotten her? But that's not the only mystery that surrounds him, for there are tantalizing clues to suggest that he actually personally hunted down the man responsible for his father's death. Philip of Cognac was recorded as being born around 1180 and had the distinction of being the only known child, either legitimate or illegitimate, of Richard. He grew up during Richard's tumultuous reign, reaching adulthood by the late 1190s. His name of Cognac comes from the lordship of Cognac in the Charente region of France, a territory that became intertwined with his fate. Richard the Lionheart, famous for his exploits on crusade and in warfare, surprisingly took time to secure a future for Philip. The king arranged a marriage between Philip and Amelia of Cognac, a noble heiress and Richard's feudal ward. By marrying Amelia, Philip stood to inherit the castle and surrounding estates of Cognac, firmly rooting him in the political landscape of Richard's Duchy of Aquitaine. This was a strategic match orchestrated by Richard. Amelia's father, Ethier V, had been Lord of Cognac, and through her, Philip could claim that valuable estate. It appears Richard wanted to provide for his son, perhaps as a loyal vassal in Aquitaine, even though Philip could never inherit the English throne due to his illegitimacy. Unfortunately, the plans didn't fully pan out, to say the least. Amelia of Cognac died young, reportedly in 1199, and the couple had no children. After her death, King Richard retained the castle of Cognac, ultimately granting it to lesser noblemen in his service. Philip's brief taste of lordship ended as quickly as it began. Nevertheless, Philip of Cognac did make a mark on the chronicles, however faint. One chronicle by Roger of Howden claims that in 1199, after Richard was slain in battle, Philip avenged his father's death by hunting down the Viscount of Limoges. According to this, Aymar V, the rebellious Viscount, ultimately responsible for Richard's fatal wound, was brought down by his vengeful son, Philip. Howden wrote, Philip, illegitimate son of King Richard of England, slew the Viscount of Limoges in vengeance for his father. No other source confirms this dramatic episode. It may be only a legend. But it shows that Philip's contemporaries knew who he was. In fact, even King John, Richard's brother and successor, noted Philip's status. A 1201 royal account book cites a significant gift to Philip, son of King Richard. After that, Philip of Cognac disappears from the records. Some have suggested he likely died sometime in the early 13th century, still a young man. That said, the ultimate fate of Richard the Lionheart's only acknowledged son remains a complete mystery. All these details paint the outline of Philip's life: a youth in Aquitaine, a politically arranged marriage, a fleeting role in the violent drama of his father's demise, and then obscurity. Yet, amid these facts, one glaring question remains unanswered. Who was Philip's mother? Every mention of Philip carefully omits her name, referring to her only implicitly, if at all. To understand why Philip's mother might be missing from the record, it helps to look at Richard the Lionheart's personal life and attitudes. Unlike many kings of his era, or any era really, Richard had no legitimate children, and only one illegitimate child. He married relatively late, at age 34, to Queen Berengaria of Navarra. That marriage produced no offspring, and husband and wife spent much of their time apart. Richard was, of course, famous for his significant time spent abroad fighting in the Holy Land. This lack of an heir was a significant issue. Richard's absence of children meant that when he died in 1199, the crown passed to his brother John. Richard's father, Henry II, had numerous acknowledged illegitimate offspring, but Richard's case was very different. All evidence indicates that Philip's mother was simply never officially identified. Medieval chroniclers usually mentioned an illegitimate child's mother only if she was notable in her own right, for instance, a high-ranking noble. In Philip's case, every record is silent on her name and background, implying she was not of high rank or political importance. Roger of Howden, who detailed Philip's supposed act of vengeance, likewise gives no hint of maternal lineage. This lack of reference to his maternal line is sometimes used as evidence in support of the act of vengeance against the Viscount by Philip. After all, if the account was entirely fictional, why not invent a fictional maternal lineage to make the young man seem destined for heroism? Even administrative records, like that 1201 pipe roll entry from King John, acknowledge Philip while keeping his mother anonymous. This anonymity could be deliberate. It's possible that Philip's mother was a commoner or lower status noblewoman, whose liaison with Richard was a private matter. If she were a married woman or a daughter of one of Richard's vassals, there may have been a desire to keep the affair discreet to avoid scandal. However, some have speculated that by keeping her name out of official records, he kept the focus on Philip as his son, and only that. So with all the facts laid out, who could she have been? Based on Philip's estimated birth, circa 1180, Richard would have been about 22 or 23 years old at the time. Richard spent those years in Aquitaine, ruling as duke and quelling uprisings among his barons. It stands to reason that Philip's mother was a woman Richard knew in Aquitaine during that period. She might have been from the Cognac region or elsewhere in Poitou. Another possibility often floated is that Philip's mother was one of the unnamed women mentioned in tales of Richard's wartime cruelty. Some have suggested that, to put it mildly, Philip's mother was not there of her own accord. Such an origin would be all the more reason not to publicize the mother's name. If the mother was from a noble family, they would hardly want it known what had happened, especially if they were subsequently vassals of Richard. If she was a common woman, such an event would portray Richard, the supposedly pious crusader king, as a monster, ruthlessly exploiting those he ruled over in the most cruel and evil way. Whatever the case, the true fate of the only known son of Richard the Lionheart, as well as the identity of his mother, remains concealed by the mists of history. Perhaps the most controversial theory is that Philip wasn't actually Richard's son at all. As I mentioned previously, kings of this era got around. That is to say, they got busy, consistently and thoroughly. Some in the Angevin court and around the high courts of Europe started to question whether Richard preferred the company of men. After all, kings of the era routinely produced innumerable offspring, and something just wasn't adding up. Under this theory, Philip's mother may have been concealed to cover up the fact that Richard either wasn't the father or simply didn't enjoy the process as a king should. Keeping the mother's name under wraps would allow this royal secret to be covered up. However, it's important to note that this is essentially a 12th century rumor that's made it to the present, and there's no direct evidence to indicate this was the case.